So there's this oft-referred idea in fiction known as Chekhov's gun. You probably know it as such. If there's a gun on the mantelpiece in your first act, then it must be fired before the end, otherwise why have it there? In more direct terms, every memorable element in your story should be necessary and utilized by the end. If it lacks any relevancy, it should be removed. Now, just because something is a commonly referenced literary principle does not make it gospel. There are many artistic reasons to break all the rules. But when you're producing a mass-marketed horror book for kids, you're not exactly aiming for the stars, and you should probably stick to the basic rules of competent, coherent narratives. But hey, that never stopped R.L. Stine. As we'll soon see, the sheer amount of unfired Chekhov's guns in this book is large enough to stock a pawn shop. Hey everybody, if you've been enjoying my Goosebumps videos over the years, or if you're new here and you like what you see, stick to the end for an important announcement. So we waste no time getting into horror territory, as the first 4 words in this book are, "We moved to Florida." Now, that right there is scarier than any werewolf. Meet the Tucker family. We have Father Michael, mother couldn't be bothered to give her a name, their 16-year-old daughter Emily, and their 12-year-old son Grady, who will be our point of view character for the evening. Grady's parents are both scientists, and they moved from Burlington. It's not specified if they're talking about Burlington, Washington, or Burlington Coat Factory, to a small neighborhood bordering the swamplands of Florida to conduct an experiment. Okay, bear with me because the Tucker family experiment is something else. Dad got these 6 deer from some country in South America. They're called swamp deer. I mean, they don't look like Bambi. For one thing, their fur is very red, not brown, and their hooves are really big and kind of webbed, for walking on wet, swampy ground, I guess. Dad wants to see if these South American swamp deer can survive in Florida. He plans to put little radio transmitters on them and set them free in the swamp. Then he'll study how they get along. Okay, I am nothing if not a professional nitpicker, so let's do some fact-checking here. First, nobody can survive in Florida. Second, there is no such thing as a South American swamp deer. Swamp deer, also known as the barasingha, are actually native to India. R.L. Stine probably got those mixed up with the South American marsh deer, which are actually a closer fit to the description this book gives. A forgivable mistake, but a mistake nonetheless. Either way, there is no way Mr. Tucker would get his hands on these guys for some unsupervised backyard experiments, because both the swamp deer and the marsh deer were endangered and under wildlife protection acts. Thanks to human efforts preventing awful scientist dads from kidnapping specimens and throwing them into Florida, both species have now been bumped up from endangered to vulnerable, but even now, you're not going to get a grant for Florida experiments on them. And then there's the issue of introducing a new species into an ecosystem not built for it. 99 times out of 100, that is not a good idea. They disrupt the food chain, they can damage existing human infrastructure, they can kill off local endangered wildlife. They're called invasive species. Now, in the interest of fairness, the really harmful invasive species tend to be small things like insects, reptiles, birds, and such. Half a dozen large, bulky herbivore mammals who only reproduce once a year probably aren't going to do too much damage, maybe. Actually, fun fact, Indian swamp deer were introduced to Texas about a century ago, back before people realized it wasn't the coolest idea. And they're doing okay, but they're also there to be hunted by humans, so we keep them in check ourselves. Mr. Tucker's just going to let these guys loose and see what happens from afar. He's not even observing them in any meaningful way. He'll be able to track their positions with a radio transmitter, but that's it. What could you possibly be learning from doing this? There's really only 2 results here. I'd say a 2% chance that these deer will thrive and kill off an entire species of flower, and a 98% chance they'll catch some swamp disease, and just before they die, an alligator eats all their faces. The only scientific result you're going to get from all of this is alligators can eat deer faces. This is lunacy. It's also completely unnecessary for this book. It's a motivation to get our characters to Florida, and it plays a role in a scene later on, but you could have substituted just about anything to get the same results without making Mr. Tucker seem like one of the most worthless scientists in the world. You can't even claim that this is adding some kind of educational element to these children's books because they get the name of the deer wrong. Oh god, we're still on page 2, aren't we? Moving on. So the Tucker family has moved right next to a swamp to test out their deer, which leaves Grady and Emily restless. They've left all their friends behind and school's out at the moment, so they end up exploring the swamp. They promptly get lost and start falling all over the place, tripping over roots and almost falling into bogs. Then they come across a small cabin in the middle of nowhere. Their curiosity getting the better of them, they approach, only to meet the cabin's occupant. Just as I was about to pull open the crude wooden door, it swung out, nearly hitting us both. We leapt back as a man burst out from the dark doorway of the hut. He glared at us with wild black eyes. He had long gray-white hair down past his shoulders, tied behind him in a loose ponytail. Oh shit, it's Sean Connery. We somehow slipped into Medicine Man. Quick kids, run! Run before Lorraine Bracco shows up and gives us another awful performance. No, this is the Swamp Hermit, who will never be given a name because he needs to be effectively othered to maximize the scares. This guy doesn't fit within our stock suburban lifestyle, so he must be evil. In fairness, he's a red herring, someone to blame for all the spookiness that's been going on, but any other horror story would make the effort to show that, oh, he's not so bad, he's just misunderstood and living an unconventional lifestyle. Arlstein never bothers to humanize him, even once it's proven that he's not the werewolf. He remains the creepy, nameless guy in the woods. I'm not sure how I feel about that. On one hand, keeping him this creepy other suggests that people who don't conform to a modern, middle-class lifestyle should be avoided, that no effort in understanding should be made. On the other hand, the Swamp Hermit's constant mystery contributes to an interesting, though certainly unintended idea that there's a lot more to this swamp than just werewolves. We'll touch back on that in a big way later. After getting chased around the swamp a bit, Grady and Emily return home and tell their parents what happened. "The guy in the hardware store told me about him," Dad said. "Said he was strange, but perfectly harmless. No one knows his name." "Harmless?" Emily cried. "Then why did he chase us?" Dad shrugged. "I'm only repeating what I heard. Evidently he's lived in the swamp most of his life, by himself. He never comes to town." "Maybe they shouldn't go back in the swamp by themselves," Mom said, biting her lower lip fretfully. She started to gather Emily's hair back into a ponytail. "The hermit is supposed to be completely harmless," Dad repeated. "Honey, we're scientists. You should know that there's no greater authority than some guy in the hardware store." God, Mr. Tucker is the worst. As a scientist, he has this really expensive operation involving exotic animals, and you'd think he'd want to get a bead on a guy who lives no more than a quarter mile away. Maybe talk to him about the experiment, ask him not to shoot these animals, maybe check to see if he has a garden that the deer might get into and warn him about that. As a parent, he really just has no problem with his kids wandering around aimlessly in a swamp he hasn't checked out himself, the safety of which is determined by the words of a stranger he met at a hardware store. Now, negligent mad scientist dads are nothing new in children's horror fiction. They're not new to Goosebumps, but Mr. Tucker isn't even that. He isn't working on some death robot or a super serum or something extraordinary in plot driving. He's just an idiot with some deer. This kicks off the long middle portion of the book, which follows a very consistent formula. Grady wakes up in the middle of the night to hear howls and scratching outside. He gets scared. It doesn't get resolved. The next day, he discovers a mystery that seems to suggest a larger picture, but in fact has nothing to do with anything. For example, we learn that this place is called Fever Swamp because 100 years ago, everyone in town came down with this strange plague-like fever. Those who didn't die went mad. I like this bit of backstory, and it sets up a bit of uneasiness when Grady himself gets sick and gets a fever, but it's in no way connected to the werewolf plot we have at hand. Grady makes a few new friends his age. First there's Will, kind of a larger, scruffy kid, and then Cassie, a little red-headed girl who's the first to suggest that there might be werewolves about, which is apparently a point of contention for Will, and the two bicker about it constantly. "Come on, guys, let's change the subject," I said. "My parents are both scientists, and they say there's no proof that werewolves exist." "That's what scientists always say," Cassie insisted. "They're right," Will said. "There are no werewolves except in movies. You're a real jerk, Cassie." "You're a jerk," Cassie shouted back. "Oh, great. Just what my life needed. Another Cassie." Here's another one of those unanswered mysteries. Apparently one of their neighbors, Mr. Warner, went missing a while ago. He wandered into the swamp to go turkey hunting and never returned. Later on, the kids stumble across the swamp hermit again, and he's carrying a dead turkey, which narratively ties him to Warner's disappearance, but that's never resolved. After this moment with the swamp hermit, Warner isn't brought up again. The reason for his vanishing is never discovered, and no connection is made to Warner and the main werewolf plot. These missed connections are really starting to stack up. Finally, a dog walks into Grady's life. He's super friendly, but also super huge and black and menacing looking. There's no collar, but Grady's parents allow him to keep the dog because they've pretty much given up on being responsible adults. Should we take it to the vet to make sure it's healthy and safe to keep around the kids? Should we go to the pound to see if anyone's looking for a missing pet? Nah, some guy at the hardware store told me that giant black dogs are totally rad. Mix me another martini, honey. Grady ends up calling him Wolf, and Wolf ends up being the primary suspect for all the howling and scratching and eventually animal mutilation that's been going on, leading up to one of Mr. Tucker's foreign deer getting killed in its pen, because the deer are staying in a pen. Yeah, the deer are never let go, even though that's the entire point of the experiment. His pajama shirt flapping over the jeans he had pulled on, Dad dragged the dead deer to the back of the yard. Then, as I watched from the kitchen window, he patched the deer pen with a large sheet of box cardboard. Yeah, that'll do it. That'll keep the beast that tore through a metal fence at bay. Keep those tasty endangered animals safe. I am the best scientist. Honey, break out the tequila. Now, Wolf also has some mystery behind him. Maybe not as compelling as the disappearance of Mr. Warner or the swamp hermit's deal or what the fever of Fever Swamp was all about. But Wolf does seem to come out of nowhere and seems to have some kind of awareness of what's going on. A certain level of intelligence under that big, rough exterior. If not supernatural, then he's at least Lassie levels of competence and smarts. He's just another patch in this tapestry of whatevers. Things are so unconnected, I actually haven't been recounting this information in chronological order. You could shuffle up these details and incidences in any order you want and still end up with the exact same book. Grady gets bit by a non-poisonous snake. It's a rare moment of actual painful violence in a Goosebumps book, but it doesn't mean anything to the story. Grady recovers, there's no ill-lasting effects, and again, it has nothing to do with werewolves. Apparently, this full moon is going to be lasting 2 weeks because all these late-night howlings and glowing eyes in the darks will not let up. Eventually, we get to the end of the book, which doesn't really discern itself from the rest of the book. Sounds in the night, Grady gets up to investigate. We've done this half a dozen times already. This book hasn't been building up to anything. It's just going through the motions, and the only indication that this time is any different is the fact that there's only 15 pages left in the book. So Grady walks out into the swamp in the middle of the night to investigate things, and he runs into Will, who is also trying to find the source of this howling. Or so he says, because it turns out he's the werewolf. Because somebody had to be. There's no real solid foreshadowing of this, though it makes Will's rather loud stance that werewolves don't exist pretty interesting in retrospect, so, point for that. Will changes and attacks Grady, biting him in the shoulder before Wolf chases Will off. And that's that. That's our werewolf action for this book. Will just disappears for some reason, and when Grady's parents go to Will's house to find out what's going on, they find it completely empty, as if no one has ever lived there at all. Hey, should we get the large bite wound on Grady's shoulder checked out? Do some blood work, make sure he doesn't have rabies or anything?
Yeah, I'm a scientist. Now, pass me that Four Loko.
We get our obligatory Goosebumps twist ending with the reveal that Grady is now a werewolf himself, spending his nights sneaking out of the house to turn into a big hairy monster and exploring the swamp and killing small animals. This is probably a puberty metaphor, but I don't care to work it out. Now, with all the griping I've been doing, you probably think I hate the Werewolf of Fever Swamp. But believe it or not, that's not quite the case. The individual elements here are actually pretty promising. There's a lot of storytelling potential that kept me hooked when I read this book for the first time 2 weeks ago. With the exception of The Haunted School, this book has a much more dangerous edge to it than any of the other Goosebumps books I've covered thus far. People get hurt. Grady gets seriously injured, first from the snake bite and then the werewolf bite. Characters come across mutilated animal corpses, torn apart by some mysterious beast. Welcome to Dead House had a surprising amount of gore, yes, but it was so over the top it became unreal. The dead rabbits and birds strewn around this book are very real. The problem is that so much of this book doesn't relate to the central werewolf mystery. If you cut out everything that wasn't relevant to the werewolf story, this book would be 12 pages long. This has the effect of confusing and disorienting the reader, who's making all of these mental notes, trying to keep track of all of these elements, and when none of them come into play, you're just left looking at a pile of unfired Chekhov's guns, wondering what the hell happened. So how do you fix that? How do you take all of these elements, all of these details and backstories and secondary characters and subplots and make them function as a book if they don't tie into the werewolf story? Well, what you need to do is refocus. See, this book is about the werewolf of Fever Swamp, when it should really be about the werewolf of Fever Swamp. The emphasis of horror should be on the swamp, not the werewolf. All these elements, the swamp hermit, the plague from 100 years ago, the vanishing of Mr. Warner, Wolf's origins, they don't relate to the werewolf, but they do relate to the swamp. The swamp is full of danger and mystery, and the werewolf is just a part of that. What would have to be changed to make this happen, to switch the emphasis? Not much. First, I ditched the whole South American deer thing. It's stupid, factually inaccurate, and doesn't contribute anything to the story that can't be replaced by something else. Hell, they never ended up releasing the deer. Those guys stay locked up in a pen for the entire book. So get rid of that, and instead have Mr. Tucker investigating a mysterious phenomenon in the swamp. Something simple like mysterious lights rising from the swamp, some kind of will-o-wisp situation. Something small, something weird that might have a scientific answer, but might also be supernatural, and nothing relating to the werewolves. While we're at it, let's give Emily her own little supernatural subplot as well. She kind of drops out of the book after the first couple of chapters. Give her something to do that has nothing to do with the werewolf and everything to do with the weirdness of the swamp. Like, idea off the top of my head, she finds a pendant belonging to a woman who disappeared in the swamp 50 years ago, and now Emily thinks she can hear the ghost of this woman in the wind. It's not the perfect idea, it needs to be workshopped, but I think just 2 more weird things happening in the swamp not related to werewolves would tip that emphasis. Make people go, oh, okay, this is about Fever Swamp. The werewolf is just the one mystery of Fever Swamp we managed to solve. Make this the Night Vale of swamps. The other adjustment you could make is have Grady be more actively investigatory. Grady has no character. He's a total blank slate. He's not even hyper annoying like the kid from Monster Blood. Most of the stuff he does in this book is either because he's bored or because he's scared. Make him curious. Make him smart. Give him the intellect to recognize all the mysteries going on around him. He's the child of 2 scientists, after all. The desire and the ability to solve problems would allow us to frame the expanse of these problems. And finally, to really sell it, in the very last moment of the books, with Grady turning into a werewolf and running off into the swamp for the night, have him mention, my senses are stronger. I can see in the dark. I have better hearing, an amazing sense of smell. I can get around faster. I can defend myself. I am now better equipped to solve the mysteries of Fever Swamp. Hey, I think I found the scent trail of Mr. Warner. Let's go find him. Werewolf detective, werewolf detective, werewolf detective. But yeah, if you just mention the fact that there's still a lot of unsolved mysteries at the end, if you say that just because this initial werewolf thing was dealt with doesn't mean there still isn't a lot of spooky shit going on in Fever Swamp, you flip that emphasis, and this book would ultimately be stronger for it. Hell, you could make this a backdoor pilot for an entire series about the horror of Fever Swamp. Werewolves are boring. Fever Swamp is where it's really at. Follow-up. I've got a really bad habit of summing things up before I get to the part of the video where I sum everything up. The Werewolf of Fever Swamp is an okay-ish book with some pretty dumb plot elements. I don't really understand its place as an iconic Goosebumps book, however. It's been a pretty strong contender every time I do these polls, and it's one of the only 4 Goosebumps books to have their own Wikipedia page. Not even Night of the Living Dummy can claim that, the book that produced the nearest thing Goosebumps has had to a consistent mascot in Slappy the Dummy. This book is perhaps a small step above many other Goosebumps books I've read in terms of general quality, but not dramatically so, not like The Haunted School. The cover is pretty great, I really like the art here, it's a well-drawn werewolf. I would not begrudge anyone who would want this as a poster, but it's just a cover, and I would really like to think that these books were popular for more than just their covers, that people got into these books because they had weird, iconic images and characters and ideas. The werewolf in this book has none of that. This is about as stock standard of a werewolf as you can get. There's no twist in the werewolf mythology, it has no unique characteristics. R.L. Stine just took the most basic, well-recognized ideas about a werewolf, everything a 4-year-old would know about a werewolf, and left it at that. Fever Swamp is far more unique and interesting, but again, that's not where they put the emphasis, and that's a shame. The structure of this book is lame. It keeps repeating this exact same scene of Grady hearing noises at night, and every time we know what it is because this is advertising itself as a werewolf book. Please don't waste the reader's time. These books are only 120 pages long, with not exactly the smallest print in the world. If you have filler in a book like that, you're doing it wrong. And just because the books are aimed at 9-year-olds is no excuse to slack off. Well, I give The Werewolf of Fever Swamp a marsh deer out of 10. Oh, hey, you stuck around. Cool. I hope you liked that video, and a lot of people really seem to like these and wish they were a regular series instead of something I do just once a year. Well, we might be able to make that a reality. As you may well know, I've started getting into video production full time, and I have been supporting myself with the help of my very generous donors at Patreon. But I have yet to reach a level which is sustainable. Here's what I propose. If we can get my Patreon up to a consistent $200 per video or higher, I will do monthly Goosebumps reviews. Yes! For as long as it's up at that level, I will produce one super snarky, way too in-depth Goosebumps review per month, skipping the ones I've already done for the Goosebumps Halloween Annual, so, no reruns. It would start with Stay Out of the Basement and potentially run all the way through Goosebumps, Goosebumps Series 2000, Goosebumps Horrorland, and Goosebumps Most Wanted. Guys, I haven't read 90% of these books. I am scared and excited at the prospect. Here's what you can get if you subscribe to my Patreon. For just $1 per video, you can advertise your product at the end of my Doctor Who book guide videos. You can advertise your website, your YouTube channel, your Etsy store, your fanfiction, whatever you got going on for yourself, I'll add that to the rotation. It's 2 ads per video. Actually, you know what? If we get to this point, I'll start adding those rotating ads to the end of my Everworld and Goosebumps videos as well. That's 4 videos a month with Patreon ads on it. And at the $5 level, you gain access to exclusive content, such as commentaries and behind-the-scenes videos. Plus, all my patrons can participate in a monthly Q&A. I'm stoked. If we can get to that $200 level in November, I'll start doing Goosebumps reviews in December. It's as quickly as that. There's a link to my Patreon page in the description. I'm excited. Are you excited? I'm excited. And don't worry if you can't contribute to Patreon. You can still help out the Pop Arena in many other ways. Liking my videos puts them higher in YouTube searches, sharing my videos gets the word out, and subscribing to my channel raises my platform and gives me access to more YouTube tools. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you all have a great Halloween, and I hope to get to more Goosebumps soon.